Hello, everyone. Welcome to Capturing Christianity. I'm your host, Cameron Bertuzzi, and today I've got a really awesome dialogue scheduled for you guys. It's all about near-death experiences. I've got Dr. Eben Alexander here and Dr. Gary Habermas, and this is just going to be a kind of a dialogue about NDEs in general, near-death experiences in general, but how maybe it relates to faith. And then also what I want to start with is Dr. Eben. If you don't know who he is, he's a retired neurosurgeon, and he had his own near-death experience that completely rocked his world. I actually wanted to ask you this at the very beginning of this, Eben. Do you mind, first of all, do you mind if I call you Eben?
No, that's fine.
I should have asked that before we started the stream, but...
Who I am.
Okay, great. So the question that I've got for you is, in any of the interviews that you've ever done, have you ever been compared to Doctor Strange?
Yes.
Oh, man.
And I don't know if I should admit that or not, but yes, there are a lot of similarities, overlaps.
You need a goatee, though.
Yeah, I do. And there are other things I could probably use to be a little more kind of Hollywood favorable. But yeah, Doctor Strange is kind of right up my alley.
Yeah. So if you don't know, he had his own near-death experience, and it completely rocked his world. He went from a materialist all the way to, I don't even know what you would classify yourself as now. We'll get to that in the course of the dialogue, but a lot of changes throughout this experience that you've had. So I want to start off just, you've done this 1,000 times on the internet. I was watching the interviews that you've done, and every single interview you're asked what your experience is. But for anyone who doesn't know, I'll ask you to do it one more time and just give me the summary. If they want a longer one, they can either read your book or they can go and watch more interviews with you. So just give us a quick highlights of your story, what happened, and then we'll get into some good dialogue here.
Yes, I will try and keep it very brief. I think the important thing is to set the stage. I was 54 years old. I'd spent more than 15 years at Harvard Medical School, thought I understood teaching. I was teaching neurosurgery, thought I understood brain, mind, and consciousness to some degree. And then my world was absolutely rocked. And I went through a profound, a week, basically, 7 days in coma due to a severe gram-negative bacterial meningoencephalitis that involved all 8 lobes of my brain. That's why my story is of so much interest to the neuroscience and the scientific community, is because the medical details really did not leave any room for that brain, that ill, to have any kind of dream or confabulation. Any phenomenal experience was impossible because of the widespread, full-depth damage to my neocortex. And yet I had the most profound, ultra-real, memorable, and detailed and kind of emotionally charged set of events in my entire life when my brain was demonstrably offline. So that kind of sets the stage for it. And the journey, and it's all written about in my book, Proof of Heaven, but it was a profound journey beginning in this kind of murky underground, what I call the earthworm's eye view, but I was rescued by a slowly spinning melody that came as packaged as basically a bright light that turned into a wormhole, a portal up into higher and higher levels. And that's what ushered me into what I call the Gateway Valley. The Gateway Valley is really beyond any possible description. It had many Earth-like features, but in those realms, this is where people have like life reviews, reunite with their higher soul, with the souls of departed loved ones, re-encounter that infinitely healing divine force of God that so many NDEers come back to this world, and once they felt that, bathed in that love, they realize there's nothing to fear about death at all, that in fact it's an expansion of our conscious awareness. Now, in that Gateway Valley, there were thousands of beings dancing down below us. In my writings, weeks later, I called them souls between lives. There was this tremendously beautiful and kind of perfect world down there of plant life, of blossoms on trees, flowers, buds, all blossoming, this incredible richness of dynamic kind of perfection. There was no sign of any death or decay. All of the joy and bliss by these thousands of beings dancing, merriment. It was being fueled because up above were these swooping orbs of angelic choirs that were emanating chants and anthems and hymns that would thunder through me. And then those angelic choirs, there was a beautiful young woman who was my spiritual companion on the butterfly wing. And those who have read Proof of Heaven or have heard me talk realize how crucial she was, because I didn't recognize her at the time. And another thing to mention is that an atypical feature of my near-death experience was that I was amnesic for the life of Eben Alexander. I had no memories of my life. I had no knowledge of humans or Earth or this universe. All my language was gone. So in many ways, it was an empty slate. And in retrospect, that was very important for some of the deepest lessons I was to learn from this. Turns out those angelic choirs provided yet another portal to higher and higher levels. And I remember seeing all of four-dimensional space-time collapsing down, all of that spiritual realm of the Gateway Valley with a different ordering of causality called deep time that accommodates things like life reviews and the evolution of all consciousness, all of that collapsing down until my awareness was one with the God force at the core of the universe. And the entire universe throughout all of eternity had been shrunken down into this complex oversphere for lessons to be taught in that core realm. But that's where that oneness with the divine, with that infinitely loving force of God that brings us into such wholeness, was something that to me was clearly the very source of our conscious awareness. There was a brilliant orb of light in the core realm that to me was kind of an interpreter or guide, although at times, as I said, I became that infinitely loving oneness at the core, bound through infinite healing love. And I would then tumble back down to that earthworm eye view, and I learned by remembering the musical notes of the melody that would enable me to go up through this kind of line of portals again, through the Gateway Valley, then to the core. And then finally there came a time when I could no longer conjure up that portal taking me out of the earthworm eye view. And then that's when I saw thousands of beings around me going off in the distance, heads bowed, murmuring energy that was completely reminiscent of the beautiful sense of oneness and being at home that I'd felt in those higher spiritual realms. But now it was occurring in these lowest realms. And when I wrote all that up, I said that was the power of prayer. It was this strong sense of connection with sentient beings in this world, and that the prayer got through. And it was a very comforting feeling that helped bring me back to this world. That's where I saw six faces. All this is described in great detail in the book Proof of Heaven, because there's much more to the story. I'm giving you the thumbnail sketch. But those six faces served as veridical time anchors. Five of them were people who were physically present in the ICU room the last 24 hours of my coma. And notably, there were many other family and friends who had been there earlier in the week who I had no memory of at all. And what that helped me to do was realize that the vast majority of my coma experience happened during those first 5 days of coma. And that's important because, for example, there was a medical case report written up on my medical records by 3 doctors who were not involved in my care, but were fascinated by my miraculous recovery that really goes beyond any kind of medical expectation. And they basically, in that case report, noted how damaged my brain was, and just confirmed the story I told in Proof of Heaven, but went even further to talk about how, in fact, this miraculous recovery, from their point of view, only happened because of my spiritual experience, because of the NDE. And they knew other NDEs with incredible healing far beyond the expectations of medicine and medical intervention. And that's why it's important, because they pointed out that that Glasgow coma scale during those 5 days was, anywhere from 5 to 7. Anything below 9 is deep coma. And given the damage to my brain, there's no way that this could have been an experience generated by the brain. So anyway, I came back to this world. My doctors had estimated my chance of survival, about 10% chance of surviving early in the week. By the end of 7 days in coma, that was down to 2% with no chance of recovery. And that's why they recommended stopping antibiotics, taking me off the ventilator, all that. And of course, that's when I came back to this world, but my brain was wrecked when I came back. All I knew was where I'd just been, this incredible spiritual experience. I did not even recognize my loved ones at the bedside, my mother, my sisters, my sons, my former spouse. I had no idea who they were. But memories came back very quickly. Language within hours, childhood memories over a week or two, all my semantic knowledge over 2 months. And during that period, I was also visiting my doctors, going through my medical records, the neurologic exams and scans, and realized this case did not line up. It made no sense. These patients, somebody that sick, could not survive and make a full recovery. And yet I did. So that is actually the way that the doctors who wrote the case report, when challenged by the peer reviewers, how do you explain this case? It's absurd. These kind of patients never come back completely. And they said it's because he had a near-death experience. That's what allowed him to have this miraculous healing and come back to this world. So that, between the medical scientists on the editorial board and who wrote up the case report, tells you how the medical world is certainly waking up to the reality of NDEs and the power they bring in terms of showing our abilities to heal.
So I'll let Gary come in a second, and thanks for sharing that. Again, I know that you've shared that 1,000 times, or probably more than that at this point. So I appreciate you doing that once again for us. And it seems like you enjoy it. Do you like telling your story?
I love it. And what I really love, though, is usually when I'm telling it like in a presentation, and I've spoken to more than 140,000 people in presentations and conferences and shared this. But the real gift is they then share back with me. And, these stories, even though people say, oh, proof of heaven, this neurosurgeon, strange experience. Well, no, these are very common. They've been going on for thousands of years across all continents, all belief systems. And that's really the power, is to look at all near-death experiences as indicative of the much grander aspects of soul that we have, and the reality of our spiritual side, and really the reality of that infinite loving God force at the core of all of existence. That's the value of them. And I love sharing it for that very reason.
I was going to ask you why you're so excited about sharing your story with everyone, and you just answered it. So that's great. So let's pull in Gary at this point. Gary, what would you like to come back on here, or just open it up for some good dialogue?
Well, I'll talk about my chief area of research in NDEs. It goes back to the early 1970s. And as I tell my grad students, that's before most of you were born. So, that's back in the Middle Ages. But that was about 1972. And I was reading Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and later Raymond Moody. And that's, I would say, probably the way a fair number of people who were reading the material back then got into the field. Then later, I got to know Raymond, spent time with Raymond several times, but Elizabeth too. And but from a very early time, my training is in philosophy, so I have a totally different discipline than Eben. And I'm a reviewer for the Journal of Near-Death Studies out of the University of Virginia. I think they call themselves the only peer-reviewed near-death journal in the world, but been working with them for over 10 years with the journal. And my chief area of interest ever since the early 70s is the area of evidence. What kind of evidence do we have for NDEs? About 10 years after my start there in 72, I was part of this group that went up to University of Connecticut about 10 years later and spent the weekend with kind of a who's who in near-death studies at that time. Ken Ring, Ray Moody, John Audette. Mike Sabom I met him a short time later, but he was not in that meeting. Bruce Grayson, just a number of people. And I remember sitting around in a circle at the University of Connecticut, and we were talking about what areas of NDE study that we wanted to talk about. And I said, I was mostly interested in evidence. And Eben, this is a medical thing, but I remember telling that group, or I remember the group telling each other that it would be kind of the way the conversation went was it would be really neat if we had some measurable data. And the way we would get measurable data, the way they said it, the way Raymond Moody said it in the mid 70s, and the way we said it in the early 80s was something like, well, wow, if we had a patient who had a flat EKG and perchance had a flat EEG, then any evidenced sightings afterwards, like a car accident out in the parking lot when you're in an operating room with no windows, or you could just make up any old story up you want. And then something like that would be measurable, maybe like by a police report or something. And this is the way they were sitting around talking. But what if we didn't have any heart or brain activity? Well, little did I know that about that same time, a bunch of journal articles started coming out. Eben, I'm sure you can elaborate. Well, I know you can elaborate on this way better than I can. That they started finding out that if you have a cardiac arrest with ventricular fibrillation, there's different kinds of cardiac arrest, but if you have one with ventricular fibrillation, your heart stops. And according to some reports, in as early as 14.5 seconds, your brain stops working. So if you give an evidenced report of an NDE, let's take the example, this is a make-believe one, but let's take an example of a car accident in a hospital parking lot and there are no windows in your room, and you get a police report and the accident happens a half hour after that time that you have no brain and no heart. A half hour is plenty of time, 15 minutes is plenty of time to say there's no heart or brain activity in that person. They give an evidence report. Wow, now we're talking about data. Well, we didn't know it at that time, that the best cases were going to come not from people who were hooked up to EKGs and EEGs, because that's a rare combination and rare to get EEGs anyway in normal surgery. And so what we thought was an impossible combination, but we thought it would be great, would be solved by cardiac arrest just a minute later. And so a lot of evidence reports started coming out. And when a few years ago, the book, the Self Does Not Die, was published, I remember in there's over 100 evidence cases. The only thing to get recorded in that book the only prerequisite was that you had to have an evidence case that was verified by somebody who wasn't in the NDE data that could be verified. And if I remember correctly, Eben, there are 36 cases in that book, 36 of the over 100 that are flat brain, flat heart cases. And some of them are rather incredible data after the state of flat brain, flat heart. One of the ones I remember most was a fellow who traveled a long way to get surgery, and he had a cardiac arrest on the operating table, as I recall, and he reported data a half hour later after this, shutdown. And some of the data were just incredible. Yeah. And so that was the kind of thing that I was most interested in and have remained interested in. I will always enjoy hearing stories like Eben's or anyone else's, and the hundreds I've heard. I would be glad to read Raymond Moody's or read anybody's in the old days when they would just give case after case after case after case, and you go for one to another. And, and then Ken Ring comes along and Bruce Grayson, and they want to tell you how many people saw tunnels and how many people saw lights and how many people had a very loving relationship there with either former loved ones or friends, or with this being of light that's variously described as an angel or Jesus or whatever. But those are the way the accounts were read. And I always enjoyed the stories. But to this day, I remain very, very interested in what the data, the evidential data show. And so I tell people, I feel like as a philosopher, that's about the only thing I can quantify are the data points. This is what happened in this world. This is how long the person was out. This is how long after this presumed state. That book, by the way, The Self Does Not Die, is an excellent book. But the cases there are incredible. And that's by far not the only ones. There's many, many others of those. That's just a lot all in one place. But I wouldn't deny what you have, the experience itself, and you have the interpretation of the experience. And to me, those are two really different things. But I don't sit there and try to deny anybody anything. Who knows what I can hear what they experienced and what they think about it. But the only places that I think touch what I'm interested in are the evidential cases that are measurable, and that's really typified by that book. So that's where I am, evidential cases, and that's the contrast. Other than that, I'm just pleased to sit around in a circle and listen to people's experiences and go, wow, okay, that's cool. So
I
Cameron, I
must
guess
say,
that's about it for my specific angle of research.
well, it's certainly very reassuring the more you study these cases. And as you mentioned, that book, The Self Does Not Die, that just came out about 5 or 6 years ago out of the Netherlands, with more than 100 veridical cases of NDEs, by Rudy Schmidt and Annie Dervin, and Titus Rivas. I mean, it's an incredible book. But you also had pointed to earlier studies, like, for example, Pim van Lommel, the Dutch cardiologist,
Yep.
who became fascinated with NDEs as early as the 1970s. And I've presented with Pim many a time. He's a wonderful physician, very careful scientist, a doctor. But he was a cardiologist in the Netherlands, and he kept having his patients report these incredible things. In fact, it's kind of humorous. The very first case he ever encountered when he was a medical intern, I think, the patient who they resuscitated, and the resuscitating team was so proud of themselves, but the patient was very dissatisfied that they brought him back. It's really kind of funny the way Pim tells that story. But he went on to analyze those cases scientifically, wrote a paper of more than 300 cardiac arrest patients where the incidence of NDEs was 18%. So a pretty high incidence, basically 1 in 5 people having these extraordinary journeys. And he wrote all that up in the scientific journal Lancet in 2001. In many ways, that was kind of the start for a lot of scientists to realizing there's much more to these than just kind of imagination and confabulation, but they tell us something very important about our nature as human beings, and the nature of consciousness and the mind-brain relationship. And then, as you pointed out, the cases have just continued to assemble. And of course, it's gone way beyond just great stories of tunnels and bright lights. For example, Ken Ring wrote up in a book called Mindsight, I think it was something like 14 examples of people who had been blind from birth, who had an NDE, and during their NDE, they could actually see and report things that they were aware of visually. And then when they came back to this world, of course, they were still blind as they had been from birth. But why is it that the extraordinary realm encountered in an NDE enables such a profound thing as kind of the ability to see when you spent your whole life not being able to see? I'm glad you referenced Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. In fact, it was her work that helped me, as I reported in the book Proof of Heaven, come to a much deeper understanding of my own journey. 4 months after my coma, when I was reading her book, Life After Death, and read this account there that helped me to understand that beautiful spiritual guide I'd had on the butterfly wing with me during my NDE. And then, of course, you have people like Ray Moody, who, of course, kicked this off with his book Life After Life in 1975, where he reported more than 100 cases of NDEs that he was aware of. And his interest, like yours, had initially been because he had a PhD in Greek philosophy. He had read in Plato how Plato wrote, I think it was in the Republic about, no, it was in the Phaedo, where he talked about the Armenian soldier killed in battle.
And that was that was Republic.
Yeah, in the Republic, you're right. And, that was what kindled his interest. But then when he went to medical school in Georgia, after he'd gotten his PhD in philosophy, he started having patients tell him these stories. And he kind of reflected back on Plato's account of And, 2,400 years ago basically said, when you die, you go through a review of your life, it flashes before your eyes, and you find that the only thing that matters is how much love you have managed to share with the world. That from, an Armenian soldier killed in battle, dead on the battlefield several days before he was put on the funeral pyre, and he woke up before they lit it, thank goodness. But that's a profound example. I mean, you could hear a similar story out of an IED attack in Afghanistan or Iraq today from a soldier. So when Ray Moody started hearing this from his patients as a medical student, he wrote that book, Life After Life, originally printed 5,000 copies, which sold out very quickly. And then he found he was being contacted by people all around the world sharing these experiences. And many of them were physicians. In fact, one of those early cases was not a near-death experience, but it was a shared death experience. And I know I had many people sharing with me their own shared death experiences. They're identical in many ways in qualities to near-death experience, even to the point of witnessing a full-blown life review. But the interesting thing about a shared death experience is it happens in a bystander, a loved one, and you could be 1,000 miles away. Doesn't matter. Distance is no obstacle in the spiritual realm. And so if your mother is passing away, and then you're 1,000 miles away, her soul can come through on the way, take your soul along, even to witnessing her life review before she proceeds on, and you come back to this world. Dr. Moody wrote that series of cases up, a book just on shared death experiences. It's called Glimpses of Eternity. I think it came out in 2011. But when I read that book, I then came to realize the stories that maybe 1 in 20 of my audience members would tell me, where it wasn't their own near-death experience, but related to a loved one who was passing from this world. And that's when I realized there was so much more to this, so much more to understand. And that ultimately it really just shows us we're spiritual beings in a spiritual universe. And that is really where the science behind all this is leading. People sometimes think this is some battle between science and religion and, who's going to win. Well, guess what? Strong spirituality and science strengthen each other. And this is where I think the modern science of consciousness is really converging on some deep and profound answers that support the reality not only of the afterlife and of this infinitely loving God force at the core of the universe that we can all come to know in these deep experiences, but that also reincarnation is very much a part of the package. That was something I never had considered before my coma, and yet my coma journey showed me very clearly how to make sense of all this. I had to realize our souls were eternal, and that it was through that process of returning to this world that we end up achieving that kind of oneness with the divine over multiple lifetimes. So I was not aware of the reincarnation literature, but it's very strongly represented at University of Virginia. I've collaborated with the Division of Perceptual Studies scientists there on many different fronts. I'm aware of more than 2,500 cases that they've reported over the last 6 decades of past life memories in children, where the best explanation is of reincarnation. And to me, it just greatly enlarges the kind of playing field. If you want to discuss consciousness, you really have to take all of this into account. But the good news is that that reincarnation literature in many ways supports kind of this eternity of soul, but also supports the message from near-death experiences of the binding force of love, and that God force has infinite power to heal. And for me as a physician, that's where the discussion opens up into things like placebo effect, spontaneous remission, and then the profound miraculous healing often seen in near-death experiences. So I think the science of consciousness is opening the reality of scientific investigation into all of these lines of inquiry. And to me, that's the real exciting part of where NDEs are leading us today.
So Gary, what exactly would you like to pick up on here?
It's a couple things, several things. One, he talked about shared experiences. Maybe we should point out that there's a couple different varieties. One is where a healthy person who's not involved with the NDE, let's say a nurse or a physician, or as he said, somebody 20 miles away, a healthy person shares the NDE of the ill person. But there's a second kind. I remember very early on when I was doing my research, one of my students at the university said to me, hey, you should talk to the youth director in my church. He's well, it was a really, really incredible experience. But as I remember the story, I'd have to check my notes, but it's been decades ago. He was in Vietnam or in a war zone, and he came home. And to make a long story short, he ended up in the emergency room, and they thought he was going to die. And while he was having his recuperation, which they again didn't think he was going to come back from, like Eben's case. Um, he was in mid-America, and lo and behold, his favorite relative, he did not even know because he'd been overseas fighting. And his favorite relative was in an East Coast hospital dying of cancer. And while he's recovering from this what brought him to the hospital, he had a near-death experience. And lo and behold, in the near-death experience, he meets the relative who was having a near-death experience in the half a country away, big country, U.S., and they compared notes, and then he came back, the soldier came back and talked to the person sitting by his bed, and the relative came back and talked to the relative sitting by his bed, and the two stories congealed. But in that case, they were two having simultaneous NDEs, as opposed to a healthy person and an ill person. So some of these are very incredible. But then again, when you get the he said, she said, and they talked about what the discussion was, and the other one's talking about the same thing on their bed. Now the relative went ahead and went on and passed away after the cancer. I think it was cancer, but the soldier recovered against everybody's surprise, and like other cases, went into ministry. When he got out of the battle zone, he became a pastor. And that's how the student met him, and that's how I got the story. So that's I got to call the guy on the phone and talk to him, and took copious notes of what this shared thing was. And all he knows is that he remembered nothing, and then all of a sudden he remembered his relative, because they were sitting there, as he said, in the clouds. He didn't have the whole orbed heavenly experience, but it was more like they were up in the clouds and they were talking with one another, and they both came back and gave the same story. So that's a case. As you said, Ray Moody's done a whole book on it, some of his and some others. Unfortunately, there's not as many of those as there are some of the real other evidence ones, but some of the shared ones. I did an essay on evidence 300 evidence near-death experiences for a Blackwell journal in Oxford. And I have these 5, I divide them up into 5 categories, and that's definitely one of them, the shared ones. Another one Eben mentioned are the Ken Rings and others on the blind, from birth. Don't see before, don't see after, only see during. And some of those reports that came back, who's out in the hallway, who's saying what, but you can't see anything except that you just reported it, and it was verified, and it's during this NDE. So those are a couple of categories. We've talked about the other ones. I think the flat brain, flat heart cases are very, very exciting. And there are other categories that would just, I call a couple of them Twilight Zone cases, Twilight Zone categories. One of them is a shared experience. I think that's kind of a Twilight Zone category. Another one is when you meet somebody who gives you evidence of something. They've been dead for 10 years, let's say, and let's say your dad, and he gives you evidence of something that, as far as we know, nobody in this world knows, and it's verifiable, but he's not near death. He's been dead for 10 years. It's the near-death observer that sees his father, like so many people meet relatives. Now, this is not for any kind of debate or anything. I don't share Eben's view of reincarnation for philosophical reasons. I think there's some issues there, even according to the writings of Ian Stevenson from UVA, which, I mean, he can correct me, but in my experience, Ian Stevenson was probably the foremost expert, another psychiatrist at the same area Eben's talking about up at UVA, a very well-respected brain specialty group up there, from which my good friend Bruce Grayson just retired a few years ago. So he's got quite a group that he can work up there with UVA. He sat there and he said, "Yeah, I work with a number of these people, and I'm thinking to myself, go ahead and give me some names. I might know those guys up there." So Good to be with those guys again. In fact, didn't Ken Ring come back down to UVA from Connecticut before he
I think he did, but
retired?
then he retired out west, and he's still out there. He writes a blog that's very good. I would highly recommend people read his blog. But I've never met Ken Ring. All
Oh,
the
really?
rest of them I've met and gotten to know very well, but he's the one I haven't met yet,
Well,
although I'd like
we
to.
were in the university that time. We were in the University of Connecticut. We actually were in his home for a while in Connecticut, and I just remember one of these old mansion type things that we see a lot of in the South here. And I just remembered it was kind of like mountainous or semi-mountainous, and there was a beautiful stream behind his house, and it was a beautiful place to get together for the weekend to discuss with the likes of, and I should tell you too, Eben, that some of the other people that were in that meeting, Carlos Osis, um, I I'm thinking of a few others, but there were a number of major researchers, and then just one of the guys in the group invited me down to his university, Georgia State, and then I
Mhm.
got to go to Mike Sabom's house and meet Mike Sabom. And in those days, there was a group we called the Big Five researchers. You could number them in those days, but uh, Ray Moody, Ken Ring, Mike Sabom, um, Bruce Grayson, absolutely for sure, probably the leading authority in the world on this
Mhm.
subject. And who am I leaving out from that meeting? I don't remember. I'll probably think of it here in a minute. But those were the days because the group was so
Yeah.
small. You could get everybody together and know everybody. And I think Ken did come down to he was a psychologist, and I think he came down to Virginia before he retired. So I didn't know he
Right.
was out west. So thanks for
Yeah, I think
sharing
so.
that.
I'm not sure where he is right now, but he does write. He's active on his blog, so that's good. Yeah, the Division of Perceptual Studies at University of Virginia is an extraordinary group, and people can get to their work very easily if you go online to uvadops.org. And I would highly recommend people visit that site. And, because it's not just Bruce Grayson and all of his extraordinary work on near-death experiences. And of course, Bruce just retired officially from faculty there, although he'll keep doing this work, for years, decades, I hope. And he just wrote his beautiful memoir, After, that came out a few months ago. And I can highly recommend anybody interested in this topic of NDEs read Bruce Grayson's book, After, because he's a skeptical scientist and he's done an extraordinary job of illustrating the reality of these experiences. So, but it's not just Bruce. You've also at UVA Dops, you've got Jim Tucker, who took over Ian Stevenson's work. He's the one who's now heading up all the past life memory in children research. As I said earlier, more than 2,500 cases, and they keep accumulating more and more cases. In fact, when you read that literature, there's really no way to come away from it uh, believing that brain creates consciousness works. It's just false. So we have a much deeper mystery to try and solve here. But their scientific study of past life memories in children has been very helpful. In addition, there's Ed Kelly. Ed Kelly is the head of kind of their parapsychological studies, and Ed Kelly, I would say, has edited three of the most profound books in the science of consciousness. His trilogy basically is the scientific cornerstone of all the work heading forward. I mean, anyone who claims to have a scientific understanding of consciousness needs to read those three books. Irreducible Mind was the first book. It came out in 2007. And then Ed Kelly edited with a lot of DOP scientists and others from the Esalen group in California. The second book was called Beyond Physicalism. That came out in 2015. I endorse that book very heartily. And then the third book, which just came out a few months ago, Consciousness Unbound. And I can tell you, it is astonishing to watch the progress through these three books to see how their thinking has changed dramatically to reflect the reality of these experiences. And in fact, the kind of philosophical position that they argue in that third book is one of what's known as evolutionary panentheism. And that really, in my mind, is about as close as you can get philosophically to the true answer. In my third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, it was co-written with my life partner, Karen Newell. In Living in a Mindful Universe, we make the argument for objective idealism, that that's the philosophical model of the universe. That, in other words, the mental realm is what governs all that we see and witness in this world. Mind over matter. It's why things like placebo effect even happen, in spontaneous remission of cancers and illnesses, infections, things like that. We talk about all of that in Living in a Mindful Universe, but we're strongly making the argument for this objective idealism, which is that the mental layer of the universe is what generates all that emerges from it. And that's why free will is such an important concept. Materialist science that I worship before my coma, and I do not use that term lightly, because materialist science is a faith-based religion that in many ways has less to support it than some of the faith-based religions. And that's because they subscribe to a disproven Newtonian determinism when they're discussing the way the brain works and all those ion channels and synaptic clefts in the brain that are absolutely part of conscious experience. There's no part of consciousness that's independent of all of those effects in the brain, but they're not causal. That's the important thing. And that's why quantum physics is also very relevant in this discussion. But to get back to the topic at hand, it's all about perception. Our perceptions, the mental world is what truly lives. And this kind of notion in materialist science that there's a bottom-up causation that results from subatomic particles following all the laws of physics, chemistry, biology, and that therefore materialist science would argue there's no such thing as free will, that consciousness is an illusion. But in fact, it works the other way around. When you realize how neuroscience, how philosophy of mind and the binding problem of consciousness, how quantum physics and all the parapsychological evidence that Ed Kelly presents for things like the reality of telepathy, a precognition, that we can know the future seconds in advance, if not minutes or more, distance healing, power of prayer, all of these effects, psychokinesis, manipulating matter at a distance with mind, things like that have been scientifically studied. When you look at this whole big picture, you start to realize that the science of consciousness actually has the power to take us to the next level in understanding. But that materialist science, the notion that brain creates consciousness, is an outmoded system that should have been abandoned 80 to 100 years ago with the advent of quantum physics. And we're finally getting to a point where all of this can fit together and make sense. And in many ways, the objective idealism that we argue for in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, is identical with evolutionary panentheism. When you realize, for example, how near-death experiences show us that oneness of God that is at the very core of our conscious awareness for all of us. And you don't need an NDE to get to know this. I know people who have achieved this through meditation, centering prayer, spontaneous epiphanies. There are many different ways to come into this knowledge. But I think it's very exciting for humanity at large, because all of this evolving science of consciousness, and if you need to get into it, certainly EbenAlexander.com and that book, Living in a Mindful Universe, can be helpful, but also uvadops.org. Read Ed Kelly's 3-book trilogy demonstrating the power, the scientific power, supporting this evolutionary panentheism. The evolutionary part is that we do have free will, and that the evolution of all consciousness is occurring as we ascend towards this oneness with the divine, that I think is the ultimate purpose of human evolution. But it's a very exciting time to be alive, and it's time to be rid of the bleak and paltry fiction of materialist science that, they can't even tell you the first thing about how the brain and mind and consciousness are related. It's called the hard problem of consciousness, defined by David Chalmers in the mid-1990s, but it's a much deeper problem than that. It's an impossible problem for materialism. And that's why we need a new model like idealism or some form of dualism that looks at the physical world and the mental world as running in parallel as some kind of an answer. But I think ultimately where Ed Kelly goes in that third book, Consciousness Unbound, Evolutionary panentheism really says it all. And don't confuse that with this talk of panpsychism. There are many people out there who realize that the mental is a huge part of this, but what they try and do is piggyback it on materialist science and pretend that proto-consciousness exists along with all these subatomic particles, and somehow when you assemble my brain out of all those subatomic particles, it's the proto-consciousness part of the particles that becomes consciousness. But that's a really nonsensical answer, and we address all that in Living in a Mindful Universe. There are far more intelligent answers where in panentheism, it's really the view that that God force of pure consciousness, that primordial mind, is in all of us. And that's why, people have accessed God and this sense of an infinitely loving force at the core of the universe through mind for thousands of years. And now as we realize that the brain is not the creator of consciousness, but only a filter that allows in primordial consciousness, that's where I think things really open up to a much richer understanding of the whole process. But it should be very enlivening for religions at large, and certainly spirituality. So many people who've had an NDE come back, and even if they were an atheist before, they say they're now spiritual, but not necessarily religious, because they're not necessarily depending on ancient scripture and teachings, but on personal experience of human beings living in the now and on their own personal experience. And that's where I think, this is a tremendous revolution in our understanding, and it really leads to a greater sense of oneness, of kindness, compassion, the binding force of love. And I think it will rewrite how humanity goes into the future. Because it is really a part of our destiny to come into this deeper understanding of the oneness of mind, and that we're bound through those forces of love that have been talked about by many spiritual leaders going back for thousands of years across all continents and belief systems. And it's, to me, very reassuring how this emerging science, which is an objective way of comparing, analyzing, and interpreting information, is leading us to this very refreshing and liberating view of human spirit and relationship of brain and mind and the reality of the soul and of our interdependence with our loved ones, even beyond the bounds of death of the physical body.
I really appreciate the fact that both of you can just go for about 10, 15 minutes each and address all of these things that each of you have said. This is actually really, really impressive. But I want to do something. I want to try to turn to focus on, because you obviously, between Eben and between Gary, you guys have a lot of agreements in your view of the world and in reality and the NDEs. I know, Gary, you think that does provide some evidence for dualism or against materialism, against naturalism. So, but let's focus a little bit, not to get too spicy or anything, but just on some of the disagreements between the two of you. So, Eben, would you call yourself a Christian or a non-Christian? How would you categorize yourself?
Well, I think it's, I grew up in a Christian church. My father was a very spiritual Christian. He was a neurosurgeon. He was very scientific. But for him, there was no conflict whatsoever in acknowledging power of prayer, a loving personal God, and his work in neurosurgery trying to help patients. For me, growing up in the 20th century, 60s and 70s, like many, I always viewed science as the pathway to truth. Now, I went to a Methodist church in North Carolina. I wanted to believe every bit of that. In my career as a neurosurgeon, 15 years at Harvard Medical School teaching neurosurgery, I found it more and more difficult to understand how awareness could survive the death of the brain and body. And I think that's why I had my NDE. In many ways, it helped me to answer that question very strongly. And then to come back and help the world understand from a scientific viewpoint how that all goes. Now, in terms of that question of Christianity, what I would say is I came back realizing that infinitely healing God force that I encountered, a God of love and mercy, acceptance, a God of unity, that sounds to me a lot like the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. And of course, Jesus of Nazareth spoke of John the Baptist, who was a reincarnated prophet from an earlier time. So the concept of reincarnation was something he was familiar with. But I would say that I came back realizing that whether you call that infinite healing force that binds us together, and that I would say is at the core of our very conscious awareness, whether you call that God or Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit, I don't care what you call it. The fact is, I would say the modern science of consciousness through the NDE, which of course is my kind of lens for focus, really supports the best of all those unifying concepts deep within the meditative traditions of all the great faiths, going back to Hinduism, Buddhism, Baha'i faith, the three Abrahamic faiths. In many ways, the deep meditative traditions of all of those have some agreement around oneness, around love, around care and compassion and kindness that I think is universal. In fact, there's a book I can recommend to people that gets at this. It's by Christopher Koppes, Coppes. It's called The Essence of Religions. And what he did, he's an NDEer himself from the Netherlands, and he wrote a book that really takes the major faiths in our modern world and shows how each and every one of them is very close to the deep and profound truths of coming from the near-death experience community, but none of them quite have all of it right. But then if you look at the NDE and what it teaches us about oneness and about eternity of soul, how we're all in this together and need to take care of each other, and this includes animals. Once you get that bigger picture from the NDE world, I think it helps to unify how we look at spirituality and how we can see how in many ways the religions that talk about this divine force of love and kindness and compassion and mercy at the core of the universe is absolutely real and is supported by the modern evidence. So I think it's a little limiting to say I'm a Christian, but I think if you hear me talk, and if you certainly realize the way I try to live my life in loving others and as much as possible showing mercy and kindness and compassion for all, it certainly looks a lot like what people might call Christianity or might call Buddhism. The only thing I would say to differentiate in terms of the reincarnation concept that I think emerges from this work is it's not the same as the way some Buddhists might interpret reincarnation as a wheel of suffering that your ultimate goal is to get off of, because in fact, the vision I had in my coma, what I call the Indra's net vision, showed reincarnation and life reviews in this beautiful net. That's why I call it Indra's net. It was a web that was concentric and led to this brilliant core of golden light that I would liken to Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's observations in his book, The Phenomenon of Man, written in the mid-20th century, where he recognized that evolution, as discussed at that time, was not just this simple biological evolution as we saw it on Earth in Darwinian teachings, but in fact that all of consciousness is evolving. And in many ways, that's the way I see this reincarnation, as something that supports a process of grace, of bringing that infinitely loving God force into our lives in a very major fashion, because I think that is where humanity is evolving. So it's a different way of looking at reincarnation than, say, the Buddhist tradition. But in many ways, I think that Christopher Koppes' book, Essence of Religions, helps to kind of show the power of these modern experiences of NDEs to help kind of adjust our spiritual beliefs. And certainly that also involves religions, although from my point of view, again, religions have a lot of agreement when you get beyond some of the scripture and the dogma that people look at as conflicting. But I really sense that the deepest message of the prophets is really one that's unifying and synthesizing and not trying to split us apart.
I was trying to give you time to respond to that, Gary. What would you like to say in response? Feel free to take the... Oh, another thing I wanted to mention is that if you want to jump in and you guys don't have to, feel free to interrupt each other is what I'm trying to say. Okay. You've been so polite, but yeah, so, all right.
I started to say, that's why we're not jumping in. We're trying to be polite and let the other person talk. From my viewpoint, I have some similarities to Eben. I have some dissimilarities. One of the dissimilarities is the panentheism, but that would be an incredible thing to try to get into philosophically. But the idealism has some similar. A lot of people don't know that Jonathan Edwards had an idealistic streak, and he was, a fundamentalist Christian from the word go. One of the great awakenings in this country. For me, I was raised in a Christian home, but I went through well, to be brief, uh, a very searching time for over 10 years where I wondered what religion was true, if any one. I was very much influenced by David Hume and some of his, Eben would probably say, mechanical, Newtonian, and materialistic type views, but he influenced me a lot. And somebody said to me one day, well, if you want to know if something's true, take a look at the resurrection of Jesus. And I said, well, yeah, I know what the resurrection is. I don't know anything about it, but I know what the resurrection is. And so I picked up this book, and it was just an introduction. It was a survey. And the guy made some comment like, if Jesus was raised from the dead, then the truths of Christianity would follow if this guy was raised from the dead, because and he went on to and he just said a few paragraphs. And I said, well, that's pretty interesting. To myself, I thought, that's pretty interesting. But I mean, I don't know that he's been raised from the dead. How do I know? Not people. It's not something you do every day. When we're talking about an NDE, we're talking about being raised. And so I started studying the resurrection, and it's been a life pursuit for me. And NDEs have fit into it real nicely for me. But what I did with my PhD dissertation at State University was, in other words, I didn't do this in a spiritual context, but what I did in the dissertation was to argue that if you only use the factual data that critical scholars are willing to grant. Now, by critical scholars, I mean atheist, agnostic, skeptic, non-Christian. It could be a Jewish New Testament scholar. There are some Jewish New Testament scholars with PhDs in New Testament, but they're not Christians. And so I started reading to all these people and coming up with a list of data. And I came to the conclusion that what they were willing to concede was enough to show that Jesus was raised from the dead. And so that's what I've been arguing for years, what I call the minimal facts argument. You can use the data that the non-believing and atheist and agnostic New Testament scholars use, and they admit all of the small amount of data that I allow, but I think that it's enough to show the resurrection happened. Now, I like that because it was historical data that you could put a stamp on. In fact, the fact that these non-Christians admitted it indicated that it must have something going for it. It must have something going for the history, because they had no history to grind. They had no axe to grind, like Pinchas Lapid, for example, non-Christian Jewish New Testament scholar, New Testament, and he believed Jesus was raised from the dead, and he left it there. It's really interesting. His view was that Jews come to God through the law, and everybody else in the world comes through Jesus Christ. And he's on the law side, the first 5 books of the New Testament, but he thought everybody else could believe in the resurrection. So into that view of that, I think the resurrection could be shown historically, I got into this near-death group in the 80s. My dissertation was years before that. And what I think NDEs do for us is to say there's an afterlife, and very clearly. But because I come down pretty hard on the evidence, I think that I think all NDE stories can be listened to and enjoyed, and I do. But I think the verification comes from what we can check. Mostly, if you read the book, The Self Does Not Die, almost all of it is verification in this, it's this worldly material. As I said, I made up that example earlier, the car accident, or now there is a car accident case, a major one that Bruce Grayson just published in his book after that Eben was talking about, quite an incredible evidential one. And so what I think NDEs show is that there is an afterlife, and a pretty detailed one. My issue is, while any of these testimonies of the actual NDEs, I said they can all be enjoyed, while any of the material there could be true, the problem of the heavenly, what Mike Sabom called the transcendental experience, as opposed to the autistic experience, the this worldly versus the otherworldly, is that most of the non-otherworldly stuff cannot be verified the same way. In my estimation, I don't see data for that. So I listen and I say, "Yep, I enjoyed it, but I can't." Let me put it this way: I think NDEs argue that there's an afterlife. I don't think NDEs give us enough to know which religion is true. Anyone, not Christianity, not any of them. I think NDEs say a religious view of life is true. There's an afterlife. I think it's a mystery. I think we'll find out when we get there. But the evidential cases are mostly in this world, and so I think that's the part I hang on, because with the resurrection, I'm looking for more empirical data. Oh, and by the way, this essay I wrote on 300 cases of NDE evidence that was published by Blackwell was in a large book. It's close to 500 pages, I think, and it's a debate between theists and non-theists. The non-theists tend to be the materialistic kind that you're talking about, and we debate back and forth about substance dualism is the name of the book. So it's all about these heavy philosophical debates about substance dualism, and I'm proposing that NDEs are a way out of the materialistic view. And now another larger book is coming out, and they asked me to redo that essay and make it, I think, twice the size of Blackwell, and I did that theme again of 5 different cases of near-death, 5 different categories of near-death cases, but that's for a book on dualism. So you have a couple books now coming out where dualism was a bad word a couple decades ago, but now it's one of the areas that Eben's talking about, that he listed dualism and some things that may be that are coming back in right now in limited circles. I think we are open to a new time. I think we are going to a new area. And I say, I don't want to sound mean, but I think the sooner we shed materialism, the better off we are, because I just think that's the philosophical boogeyman in the closet, let's say. And I think that we have to present all kinds of different data. Eben mentioned prayer a little earlier. I mentioned with a very well-known atheist in a debate years ago, I said, we have a lot of indications of this world. A few of my friends have written books on miracles. Craig Keener and J.P. Moreland got some new books coming out, but Craig already published 1,000 cases. And miracles are, but I said to this guy in the debate, I said, and you've got a very few double-blind prayer tests. And he said, nope, they're all false. They're all false. Those things backfire. They're no good. Well, some of the prayer tests did backfire. One of them, you were more likely to be healed if you weren't prayed for than if you were prayed for. That's interesting. But there are 3 that I know of, 2 in particular that have been written up for secular medical journals, double-blind prayer tests. One of them, the Southern Medical Journal, the précis at the beginning. Now, picture this in a medical journal. The précis says the results of this double-blind prayer test is that prayer to the Judeo-Christian God brings results. That was published in a medical journal. And that was back in that was 88 or 89. But there's a couple of those now with double-blind prayer, and there's also some healing ones with pre and post MRIs, CAT scans, X-rays, all kinds of things. So I think we are in a world right now where, thankfully, materialism is going out the window. I think it's out the window, but I think it's going there. And people are realizing and I would agree with Eben on this. He made the comment, I wrote it down here. He said NDEs are his lens and focus, or one of his focus points for this. I think NDEs, according to surveys, are doing probably more damage to materialism right now than almost anything else. People are realizing they can't keep barking up the wrong tree and saying what they're saying and trying to come up with, I mean, if you can believe this, people have even tried to come up with naturalistic explanations for NDEs. And when there's over 300 evidential ones, and there's many I don't have, there's probably 400 or 500 evidential cases. the more they can't explain them, the more they're left with a huge gap. And the more the lack of explanation involves an afterlife, right away somebody says, now I've got to be thinking about ethics. I've got to be thinking about what I'm doing, because if materialism's false, what's true about the world? And so that's where the NDEs came in for me as should I say, a blood brother to the resurrection of Jesus. The resurrection formed my religious views after those studies. And NDEs, to me, are strong empirical evidence of some kind of afterlife. But again, I don't think NDEs tell us what religion is true, just that there is an afterlife, and you're free to go do research and see which one it is, or what the answer is, So.
Yeah, I would just add that, NDEs in and of themselves will never prove the afterlife, because those people don't go on to die. But when you look in the bigger context, and for example, we get into that bigger context in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, and Ed Kelly gets deeply into that context in his 3 volumes, Irreducible Mind, Beyond Physicalism, and Consciousness Unbound. And you bring in quantum physics, philosophy of mind, neuroscience, all the evidence for parapsychological phenomena, etc. You paint this really big canvas, and for the kind of militant atheist materialist, it's like a game of whack-a-mole, trying to knock all these pieces of evidence out. But together, they present an overwhelmingly supportive view of the reality of our souls existing beyond the death of the physical body, and our souls coming back again and again. And not only that, but that so many times when people have an NDE, they will see, in fact, one of the most universal things across all cultures is that you see the soul of departed loved ones. Now, in some recent studies I've seen, 1/5 of those cases, they didn't know the person had died. The NDEer who sees the loved one, and they come back and say, well, I saw Uncle Ralph, but he's not dead. Then they found out Uncle Ralph died a few weeks ago, something like that. It's astonishing how, that very vision of a departed loved one, or of a loved one in an NDE or in a shared death experience, is often indicative that, yes, they have passed on from the physical world. In fact, you do the statistics, and it's never the case that you make a mistake the other way, that you think they've died, but they're still alive. And it's astonishing how powerful that discriminator is, and goes back thousands of years. In fact, my own mother had the very same thing happen back in April of 2019 when she left this world at age 99, and she spent her last 4 days kind of deeply unresponsive with the respiratory thing, and at her age that just completely made her unresponsive. And I wasn't with her until the last 2 days of that, but on the second day of this 4-day kind of unresponsiveness, at 2:30 in the morning, she woke up, she got her nurse up and said, my mother's here, call my children now. It was 2:30 in the morning, the nurse didn't want to do that. We only heard about it much later. But to me, the very fact that she saw her mother was the imprimatur, the stamp of approval. But it meant, yes, absolute real event. And she's very close to death. In fact, if you look at the statistics of people who have studied that, to have that kind of a vision.
Hopefully he hasn't gone away too far. Gary, are you still there? It looks like I can still hear you.
I'm here.
Okay, Eben, yeah, we're here. You cut out just for a second, so just pick up.
How far my story?
Looks like you're still cut.
We might be having some internet problem. This is embarrassing.
No worry. I mean, this is
now?
so. I can hear you, but it's still kind of choppy, and your video hasn't returned. We'll just we'll hang out for a second.
Do you want me to call back in? Is that the best way?
No, I think that if we just give it a little bit of time, it should come back. What's nice is that on YouTube, I can cut out this portion of the video, so that way people who are watching live, it'll be fine. But
I was trying to share the story about my mother when she passed at age 99 in April of 2019. Did any of that come through?
The beginning of it.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll try and share it again and hope that Maybe she's doesn't want me to tell this story. That could be what's
The
going
part
on.
the part about her mother being present. We heard that too.
Yes. Well, that's the important part. She's spent the last 4 days of her life unresponsive, at age 99, and really non-communicative. And yet, at 2:30 in the morning, 2 nights before she passed, she woke up. She woke up her nurse and said, "My mother's here. My mother's here. Call my children right now. This is, oh my God, she's really here." And then she was back into unconsciousness. The nurse did not call us because it was 2:30 in the morning, and we only heard about that much later. But to me, that kind of thing, that she saw her own mother, that's the important thing. That means, yes, this really happened. These are not hallucinations. Some doctors call it terminal delusions, that you see these things, but there's this phenomenon of terminal lucidity or paradoxical lucidity where people have very profound visions of their loved ones. I had one example of that in the book Proof of Heaven. And it happened to a colleague of mine who happened to be the chairman of one of the top neurosurgical training programs on earth. He didn't know how to explain it, that his dying father could witness the soul of the grandmother, the dying patient's mother, right there at the foot of the bed. And my neurosurgical colleague was convinced that the father saw this. Even though he didn't see her, he knew she was really there. And that, I think, is the important point. These are not hallucinations. They happen, millions of times in this world. And the more people can share those kind of experiences of deathbed visions, the more they realize eternity of soul. And it goes beyond anything that might be called a hallucination or drug effect or confabulation by materialist scientists. When you read the evidence and read the work, for example, from uvadops.org, you'll learn a lot more about all of this. And this is what really, the NDEs are the tip of the spear. But in many ways, the shaft of that spear is all of this other evidence of the science of consciousness, of non-local consciousness, of consciousness beyond the brain, that helps us to understand much more deeply the true nature of human spirit and soul.
Eben, I've got a question for you. Gary, I'm sure that you've got lots of things to say, but Eben, I have like 1,000 questions for you, but I'll ask this one. What do you think, someone who hears your story, what do you think they should come away believing? What would your story, what do you think it should convince people of?
I think it should just convince them that they are much more than their physical body. That in fact, in many ways, being in these brains and bodies is like being in the shackles of a prison. And when we die, when we leave our physical body once and for all, our soul, our awareness is actually liberated to a much higher level. That's why people in NDEs very routinely describe, encountering souls of departed loved ones. More than half of NDEs involve a life review. The life review is going back in detail in the events of your life, not some vague sepia-tinted memory, but reliving in intense detail. And the emotional perspective of others is what you really witness it as, not as your own kind of self-view, ego view looking out at the world, but you experience it as from the perspective of those around you who were impacted by your thoughts and actions. That's why in many ways, I would say the golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated, is written into the very fabric of the universe through the life review, which shows us we're sharing the dream of that God consciousness, of that one mind. And in sharing that dream, we learn that treating others with the respect and dignity of the sacred beings that we all are is a crucial part of our understanding of this world, of our existence, and what we're here to learn. So I think most fundamentally, the important lesson is we're much more than our physical bodies, and that in fact, when our loved ones leave the physical world, they're not gone from us. They're still available. We can access them. Sometimes they can reach out to us, anytime. I give several examples of that in Living in a Mindful Universe. But we can connect with them in prayer and meditation, spontaneous epiphanies that might happen during our normal waking consciousness. These are all opportunities. We simply need to be awake to it and understanding. And in this world of COVID pandemic and all the economic collapse, there's been a tremendous amount of death, suffering, bereavement, people dying, quote, alone, although no one ever really dies alone. because as soon as you have one foot in that other world, you're welcomed by all of these loving beings, angels and departed loved ones, etc. But the fact of the matter is our world is in a lot of trouble now, a lot of political polarization. And it really is time for us to come to a deeper understanding of kind of the meaning and purpose of our existence. And that is where I would say this kind of awakening can be very helpful to people, to come to realize there's nothing to fear about death. Now, murder and suicide are not correct answers to any question. They remain, severe violations of some of these deep principles that you see from our experiences with NDEs and deathbed visions and all that. So it really is kind of coming to harbor a sense of oneness, connection, and love with our fellow beings. I think that's really the deepest message from NDEs, that we're really here to take care of each other. And that especially includes the least, the last, and the lost, the refugees, those who have been disenfranchised from our economic gains in this world. We're really here to care for each other. And that's probably the most fundamental lesson of near-death experiences and of this emerging science of consciousness.
Yeah, that was another thing. I mean, we didn't really talk about it a whole lot here, and you've done interviews on this where you've talked about your transforming views on consciousness and backed on the science of quantum mechanics, and there's just a lot there that we could go into, but we just don't have time to. Are you open, Eben? Are you open to taking a question from the audience?
Sure.
Okay. Now this one is going to apply a little bit of skepticism to your personal experience. So it's from Maverick Christian. He says, "What is Eben's response to reported evidence that his NDE experience was fraudulent? For example, testimony from one of the doctors who treated him."
Well, unfortunately, there was an article written, and so there is one person who put this viewpoint forward. And the sad thing is, he wrote this article. It basically took some of the facts of my life and twisted them so completely that it absolutely distorts the conclusion of a rational human being reviewing the data 180 degrees from the truth of the matter. Now, people who want to get more into those questions, if you go to ebenalexander.com, look at the FAQ section there, and that's where I address some of those issues. But the important thing to point out is that article was written by someone who was basically, they were trying a new experimental model for a clickbait paywall, $1.99. They'd seen my book just skyrocket through the bestseller list. It spent more than 2 years on the New York Times bestseller list. It was in the #1 position for 42 weeks. And they saw this as an extremely attractive target. So they thought if they could attack me, do a defamatory, libelous hatchet job, that they could make a windfall because they were going to charge $1.99 per read of this story. The sad thing is that story has a lot of backlistings supporting it on the internet and on Wikipedia, things like that. And even though that particular author seems to have been banned by the publishing industry, if you Google his name, you can't find that he's written anything in the last few years. He just disappeared. And he was a prize-winning author before. I think what happened, there's an excellent rebuttal of that article. If you go to iands.org, put in as a search term Mays, M-A-Y-S, Alexander, you will find an article by Robert Mays on how that Esquire article distorted the facts of my case. And it is a tremendous rebuttal because they basically end up, Dr. Mays concludes maybe 15 or 20 different counts of journalistic malpractice that author committed in writing that article. And it's an incredible takedown. I mean, and it's all stuff that you can check yourself. For example, there's one part in that article where he refers to a video where I was invited by the Dalai Lama to speak about reincarnation in the modern science of consciousness at a graduation ceremony out at Matripa College, which is a Buddhist college out in Portland, Oregon. And I was invited to give this talk. And so this attack article that you're mentioning refers to that interchange. It's available to anybody on the internet. Just go look at the interchange. And what you will see is the way that is reported in that attack article is completely different from what is there for the video, for anyone to watch. So there are many examples of that. Again, if you go to the FAQ page on my website, I address some of them specifically. The accusation that I was fired from medical positions, there's no truth to that at all. And likewise, some issues around a malpractice case that involved an alleged distortion of records. Well, if you read my FAQ on my website, you realize that in fact, I was the one who reported that case. The patient did very well. In fact, that was the confounding part, was even though it was a wrong level surgery, one level off in someone with 3 levels of disease, the patient did beautifully after my operation. But I had to get him to come back in the office so I could tell him about the wrong level surgery. Anyway, it was all my responsibility to the patient to make sure that he was handled well, and not the way it was portrayed in that defamatory and libelous article that was in Esquire magazine back in the summer of 2013. And it's really a shame. I think when you read the Mays rebuttal, you will absolutely find how egregious and offensive and libelous and defamatory that whole article is. In fact, I think Esquire magazine would do a good job for the world to print a retraction of that article and basically print Robert May's critique of it. Again, these are facts anyone can check out there on the internet. And the stuff that author brought up was stuff he claimed to have obtained from court records. But in fact, all he did was take the original accusations in malpractice suits. And I was never found guilty of malpractice at any time. And when people realize that 1 in 5, the average neurosurgeon in the US, according to New England Journal of Medicine, is accused of malpractice once every 5 years. So it's something you just get used to. And an accusation of malpractice has nothing to do with committing malpractice if you're not found guilty. And I was never found guilty. So it was all an effort by an unprincipled writer who's a great fiction writer, but he belongs nowhere near any kind of documentary evidence. And he pretended to be writing a factual story about me. But obviously, he got blackballed from the industry. He, as far as I can tell, you Google his name and you won't find that he's written anything in the last few years. And for an award-winning journalist before his attack on me, if you go to his website, you don't even find that article referenced. He, I assume, is embarrassed about it. I don't know. But anyway, it's really a tragedy to me, mainly because I think anyone who watches my videos, reads my books, etc., you realize the story is very different. The story brought up by that writer is a story of deceit and of malfeasance, but it's his malfeasance and his deceit and his lying that happens. In fact, if you do a little more research, you'll find he wrote a book called Patient HM. And that book was challenged when there was an excerpt in the New York Times when it first came out a few years ago by 200 scientists who wrote a letter to Scientific American challenging his account in that book, especially around Suzanne Corkin, who was one of the neurophysiologists or the clinical researchers at MIT who studied this patient HM. But what you'll find is his track record with the truth is very dark, and he just stomps all over the truth. So it's a shame that article is still out there. It's a shame that people perpetuate it and talk about it as if it has anything to do with my story. No, that is the story of the author who wrote the Hatchet article attacking me, and it has nothing to do with my story. And I think it's really a tragedy because many people will read that account and then they'll just dismiss my story and say, well, he made it all up for financial gain. Well, guess what? I've given the story away as much as I can. On the internet, you'll find millions and millions of views of my sharing the story, never to gain any kind of financial gain at all. To me, the important thing is to help this world.
So we've only got like 4 minutes left in the time that we've allotted for this dialogue. And so what I want to do, Gary, you've unfortunately we haven't let you talk in the last 20 minutes or so. So, Gary, let's turn it over to you. What would you like to say? And then just provide some kind of closing comments about the dialogue.
Okay. Well, it's Eben and I have been we've done things at a distance. Eben, you and I were involved in a movie shooting here that happened about a year ago that I know of, and they were leaving my house and they went up to yours. So we've been together, but
Mhm.
I mean at a distance. A number of NDE people were covered in that film on the movie on NDEs, and so I'm glad to be with you again. I think, in summary, from my viewpoint, if I were going to state where I'm coming from, back to my skeptical days, which took way too long. I was too close to some of that materialistic stuff. Uh, for me, you can sum up the ideas in two sections. Number one was when that idea was put in my mind about the resurrection of Jesus, and I studied it, and I've come down the road. I'm getting ready to publish a major treatise on this, but again, if critics allow the data, non-Christian atheists, by their own word, atheists, agnostics, non-Christians, allow the data, then and they think it's and they're specialists. They think the material is good. I think that if we use only those data, we can get a resurrection. Now, from there, a short time later, I got interested in NDEs, and for me, the NDE is the general picture. The resurrection is the specific picture. The general picture for me is that I would agree with much of what Eben said. I think that NDE showed that there's an afterlife. I think that what he calls a spiritual reality, I don't have a problem with that, supersedes the material reality. I think materialism in its different forms, which dominates many of our universities, if not most, is bad for our culture, bad for ethics, bad for he kept using the word love. I think it's bad for those things, and I think that what happens with NDEs, we have evidence for an afterlife. I think most of my disagreements with Eben, and I'm sure probably he with me if we were discussing this, is the interpretation of NDEs. I don't put a lot of interpretation on them because I listen to them and I just let them sit there because I don't think there's the heavenly, well, there's the hell cases too, but I don't think in that's about 18%. I don't think either one, the heavenly cases or the hell cases, I don't think they translate to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 about reality because I don't think there's measurable data there. So I take them for what they are, experiences, testimonies, and I just let them sit. For me, I think for sure there's an afterlife, and I find it mostly expressed through Jesus Christ and the resurrection. Um, I teach only PhD students here, so we're doing a program where we go into a lot of this detail, but I don't ever try to unpack the transcendental portion of the NDEs because I think that's, like I said, testimony. It's the interpretation, both Christian and non-Christian interpretation, that I have issues with. Some people would say, "Well, I bet you like the hell stuff because you're a Christian." Actually, I don't. I don't think the data for there. I don't think it cuts either way. I don't think it proves either reality. I just think they're nice testimonies I can listen. But again, the overpowering data from NDEs is that there is an afterlife. And then for me, once you know there is, I find the most impressive rational data to be what we can find for the resurrection of Christ and the truth of Christianity. But that's where I am, and I love the NDE topic. Probably 1-2 punch for me would be resurrection NDE. It's where most of my research is through my whole life, and I really appreciated coming on today. And Cameron, thanks for having us. And Eben, really enjoyed hearing your view and talking. And I think if we were next door neighbors, we'd be watching a lot of football games together or sitting down and chatting and having a good time.
We probably would. I'm sure we'd be talking a lot about this because I mean, I
We would
love
be.
it. I mean, to me, this is
Agreed.
very important discussion. So I've enjoyed this very
Agreed.
much. And Cameron, appreciate your invitation. And people can learn more about me at ebenalexander.com. Like I said, there's a lot more information there to help people understand my story. There's also a medical case report in Bruce Grayson's recent book, After, that really talks a lot more about my case. His whole chapter 10 is devoted to it because it's had a tremendous influence on the scientific community. And I look at all this as a gift that I share with the world, and the world shares back with me. And I wish we had more time, though, Gary, because I had several thoughts about kind of reincarnation, especially as it's reflected in modern
I love
NDE
it.
experiences that
I'd love it. I'd
really
love
helps
the
take
I'd
us to
love
a
the
whole new level.
I'd love the philosophical. I think you mentioned enough philosophy in your part. I would have a great time going around with you on the philosophy. In fact, we don't live that far apart. Maybe we could even do it. But I'll
Okay.
just say too that my website is GaryHabermas.com. I've got a mixture of a lot of these things: resurrection, NDEs, the prayer studies, a lot of things, and I have a YouTube channel too that can be gotten through for my just from my name, and people can look and take and not take and use what they want and make their own conclusions.
Man, this was great, and Eben, I appreciate you staying. We're just a couple minutes past on the time, so I'll let you off here in just a second. But I really appreciate you coming on. I did want to say this. So for those of you that are kind of skeptical, maybe still skeptical about Eben, and I even had one person call him a grifter on my Facebook page. I don't know anything about that, but I did want to say that Eben, he did not, like him, his assistant, no one charged to come on the show today. So just factor that in when you're starting to think through some of the things that you might be thinking about Eben based on some of this, this stuff. Anyways, I just wanted to mention that. I hope you don't mind me saying that, Eben. I really appreciate you coming on.
Well, it's sad to me because if people only read that article, they're very misled, and they're led in the wrong direction. They're led to a complete falsehood, and they're being lied to, and they're being lied to intentionally. Originally, it was for money, for Esquire to get their $1.99 clickbait. But the thing has taken on a life of its own now. And it's really sad because it cheats a lot of this world out of a very deep and profound story that could help this world come into much more love and harmony. And that's what I think is the tragedy of that particular story and its lies and deceit.
So on the topic of reincarnation, are you both interested in coming back on for a dialogue on that?
I'd be happy to.
Sure. All my comments would be from a philosophical viewpoint. In fact, I don't have anything medical to say about them here or there because that's not my area. But for me, it's just something I entertained and actually got much of my critique from comments by Ian Stevenson and others who accept it themselves. So that's Cameron, I'd be okay doing that sometime.
Yeah, and it wasn't actually.
I would just add that my commentary would be on a lot of the literature on reincarnation, but certainly expanding that into the kind of modern science of consciousness. To me, all these things are very interrelated, and it makes much more sense if you broaden the discussion to cover all of them and not just limit it in any way. Because, like I said, NDEs alone will never tell us the truth about an afterlife. But in the context of all this other information, they paint a very clear picture of the reality of our souls having an existence beyond the death of the brain and body.
Well, Eben, I also wanted to thank you.
Cameron, I'll just say real quickly, I think that last comment of his, I think, is profound. NDEs don't do everything. They don't do religious work for you. They don't tell you what religions are true. But what they do very, very well. It's probably the best data for the reality of afterlife. Right. And then you got to go on your search and launch out after that. But what NDEs do, they do well. They just don't do a lot because beyond that, you got a bunch of testimonies and you have to make sense of them. So you're on your own. But the data for afterlife, I think, nearly irrefutable.
It is irrefutable. I mean, when you get into that literature, you realize this is the way the world works. So it's high time for people to learn that. It'll help tremendously with all the grief and bereavement we have with all the death during COVID, and all of that is in many ways mitigated through a deeper knowledge of our true nature and spirit.
I feel really bad about you guys both committed. I mean, Gary, before this even started, you were like, "How long are we supposed to go?" And I was like, 90 minutes. And you're like, "That's news to me." So I appreciate both of you.
Well, you hadn't told me how long it was, so I didn't know. And at the last minute, Eben, I wrote to him and I said, "Hey, are we on for an hour?" Because I do a lot of interviews, dozens, and they're almost all between 40 minutes and an hour. So I thought it was an hour. But man, he said, "Well, Eben's going to be here for 90." And I thought, if Eben's going to be here for 90, I'm not leaving at 60. So, we'll talk.
Well, you can have the last word, Gary.
Well, I wanted to say this. I might have to take Gary's spot here because Eben, I wanted to thank you for introducing me to the evidence for reincarnation. It's kind of sparked a sort of side interest for me. So I've been watching some debates and listening to some things. And so I'm in the process of scheduling a debate on this channel. It may not be like a formal debate. It'll be more of a dialogue, kind of like this. But I'm in the process of scheduling a dialogue on the evidence for reincarnation, which is actually super interesting. It's just fascinating. Right. So I wanted to thank you for introducing me to that.
Well, my pleasure. I'd just like to point out for your audience, this year, 2 books have come out from Division of Perceptual Studies for the lay public to address all of this. One of them, of course, After, by Bruce Grayson, is about near-death experiences and what happens afterwards. And the other one is called Before. That book is from Jim Tucker. And it's actually a compilation of 2 previous books he wrote that are excellent books about reincarnation. I strongly recommend those books to anyone out there with an interest. But it shows their great sense of humor that before and after, they basically kind of encapsulated the bookends of life beautifully. Highly recommended.
All right, we've gone on far long enough. Let's go ahead and thank you both for coming on. It's been a great conversation. Again, very polite. You guys talked, and then the other that was I've never had a discussion like this on the channel where it was awesome. Thank you guys both.
Great. Well, thank you, and it's been great talking with you, Gary. We'll talk again soon.
Eben, enjoyed it. Cameron, thanks for the double invite, and Eben, finally nice to get together with you after coming brushing and never meeting all this time. So that's great.
Good. Excellent.
All right, and we'll see you guys in the next video.
Next time.
Bye-bye.
Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?